Hello, my name's Kev from Data Sites, and in this video I'm going to passionately speak about, because it genuinely is a passion of mine, teaching non-technical people, average business users, how to read SQL, and we're going to apply that to some Xero data in order to create a SQL view that can be used for sales analysis. So why do I know this works? There's been a massive shift since we've been operating, definitely in the last 6 years, around business users, so non-technical people who do create reports, and essentially the appetite for doing that, as well as the readiness to just pick up tools, learn a little bit, get going, get results, and actually focus on using the data as well. So one of the biggest things in this area, like if you're exporting stuff into Excel and you're using functions and formulas, you can easily read SQL. Trust me, that is way harder than doing anything with SQL. It massively reduces the complexity of your Excel or whatever reporting tools that you're using. You essentially want to do all the data crunching up where your data lives, and you want to make reports as dumb as possible so that the overheads, the maintenance reduces, the performance increases, the reusability increases. It's huge. Of course, you can use AI to create SQL, to write SQL, which I'll show you towards the end. However, just having these few key concepts that I'm going to go over in this video is going to massively help you validate that, and therefore actually use AI, the AI query ability, query generating ability, to its full potential, and make sure that you have a much better experience and actually, get as much value out of it as is literally there. And again, just to highlight, if you can write a couple of Excel formulas, or some of the stuff I see is absolutely crazy if you can do any of that, or even if you can't. I honestly believe that this is not rocket science. It's been around for about 50 years. There's nothing super cutting edge or crazy about it. It's just about doing a few fundamentals correctly. Okay, so let's get stuck into it. So what we're going to be doing really is pulling together invoice data, credit note data, bank transactions data. If you look at your profit and loss or income statement section, the revenue section at the top, well, that's useful, but actually drilling down into that to actually see the invoices and the line items of those invoices that make up that data, who it's actually, who the contact or customer is, etc. It gives you a huge amount of flexibility when you want to look at pretty much anything to do with your sales. And of course, by including credit notes in there, refunds, etc. from bank transactions, you really are building up a perfectly accurate data set that you can go ballistic with for a multitude of purposes down the line. So we're going to start at the beginning. It's always important to just understand what is the data that we're going to be querying. So we have living documentation, aka the Xero API documentation, and we'll just super quickly go there. This might be interesting because this is literally the contract that we get the data from Xero, and this is true of any single platform. We connect to over 100 different SaaS apps. All of them have an API, and an API documentation is never the same, but usually the documentation is accurate, and you can use that as a reference of how you want to plan to get access to the data. Obviously, I'm not going to expect you to learn anything. I'm here to teach you, so we'll really just focus on invoices first. So by clicking, I just Google Xero Accounting API, it brings me to this page, clicking on invoices, and here it's important to then start going, oh, that's actually there. Here it's important to start actually going, okay, cool, there's different invoice types, there's the contact information, there's some invoice level totals, blah, 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 prepayments, overpayments. There's a lot of information here, but obviously we're just going to start with the most important parts and the basics. And then the concept is true of most platforms, whether it's journals and journal lines or whatever. There's, if you look at a typical invoice in Xero, or any platform, there is the invoice detail at the top. So for example, these fields at the top there will be sitting at the invoice record level, and then there'll be one or more line items, and that gives you the chance to describe obviously the thing that you're selling or charging for or whatever it may be. So it's often this information here coupled with invoice information that gives you the picture that you want. And we won't go into it in this video, but if you looked at credit notes, exactly the same. You get a credit note, and you obviously get your credit note line items, etc. All right, cool. So we could, for example, we have here some raw data that's come directly out of Xero, and we could go and have a gander and have a look at all the columns. There's obviously a lot of fluff. A lot of people will be exporting this directly into the tool of their choice and then using, say, relationship modeling or formulas to just cut out the gumph, rename columns, filter for only authorized invoices, whatever it is. But again, really the power comes in doing that in one central place. You only have to curate it once, you only have to validate it once, and then whatever reporting tool you pull that into, for whatever purpose you want to use it for, you're good. And if of course you do want to change something, like say for example, we're not going to in this video just for shortness sakes, add for example tracking categories into there, you only have to do that once. You don't need to open up the 55 Excel spreadsheets where you've pulled invoice to and then go and add all that logic in each of the ones. So again, reuse, performance, and reducing the maintenance over time. So what we're going to do, you could be using any SQL editor that you wanted. So again, you could be using any SQL client, they call it, if you're a technical geek person, but any SQL editor, really. There are free ones, SQL Server Management Studio, Visual Studio Code, there's ones for Mac. It doesn't really matter. Here we're inside our platform, but the concepts are exactly the same across all of them, because again, it's been around for 50 years, so we're not exactly on the cutting edge of technology here. We're just doing the basics well and properly. We'll start off with essentially just a basic select statement. That is predominantly what we'll be doing in all of our interactions with SQL, because we're doing reporting, so we are reading the data. There is of course updates and deletes and a whole bunch of other things as well, but for all intents and purposes we're just reading. So quite simply, if you look at the invoices table, these are what's called the column names, and if we want to go and select all of them, top 100 records, that's what we do. Now what I'm going to do is, instead of boring you to death with me going and typing things out to the nth degree, we are going to just copy and paste this in and then go through it line by line, and in that way get to our end result. And again, this has, without a doubt, especially because there's a group by in here, the majority of things that you'll be wanting to do. Okay, so again, we started with the highlighted keywords. There's obviously the select statements, and we can see the columns that we're going to be pulling in: invoice ID, invoice number, contact name. We will get to the sum of the line items and the account code, and this one as well. So bear in mind that in this data set we could have multiple zeros that we'll be consolidating, therefore it's important that we hand in here, and I'll highlight that from a little bit. Next most important thing, with the keyword from. Which table do we want to select from? Fairly obvious in this instance, from the invoices table. This little I here, we could call this inv if we wanted, that doesn't really matter, but it's really important when we join to multiple tables. We know that we're going to be joining to the invoices table and the line items table in this instance. If we wanted to join to the tracking categories table, that would be another join. If we wanted to, say, bring in some of the other fields from, say, the chart of accounts table, we'll be joining to that table. So you can have as many joins as you want, essentially. So it's always important to give the table that you're querying an alias so that you can identify that in bits in the other parts of the query. And you can see over here, anything that's coming from the invoice table, we're prefixing with an I dot. Obviously that's from the invoice table, and these two here are from the line items table. Another very useful thing to do is renaming things. It seems really simple, but at the end of the day, it's one of those things that people do use some Power Query in Excel for, or they just have badly named things in their reports. You really want to have a really nice, clear data set so that everybody in your business knows what they're talking about, because 95% of the time, whatever those wonderful API developers such as myself decide to call things is invariably not the same as what you will call that in your business. So it's a fantastic opportunity to stamp the name on as you intend to use it and go for gold. So we could decide to use this as customer or something along those lines. Right. Now, this next bit is probably the most complicated bit to convey. But all you really need to know is that a join is when you want to take your invoices table and your line items table. Now, if you were to look at both of those columns of those tables, in order to join something, you need something in common in between them. And in this case, not oddly enough, It's the invoice ID. That means that the invoices table has an invoice ID column, and the line items, which will probably have more than one line item usually, will also reference that line item ID, that invoice ID. So think of it this way, that this particular invoice has an ID. Here it is up here. It's not human readable. It's called a global unique identifier. And the important part is that in the line items table, although you can't see it, this invoice ID up here has been stamped on each one of these records. So if there was 9 line items in here, there'd be 9 invoice IDs matching on there. So coming back to it, what we're doing is we're saying join line items. We're giving it an alias of LI, and we're saying, hey, Mr. SQL Engine, please would you join the line item invoice ID equal to the invoice.invoice ID. And then this little bit over here you can probably ignore, but that is because in our invoices and line items table we actually have multiple zeros in there, which is extremely powerful when you have that sort of situation set up, but for this point in time, not really a big deal. There is one little big difference here between an inner join and an outer join. Usually you really want to go with an inner join. What that means is that we're saying, hey, I don't want any records from either of these tables where there aren't matching records. If you've got a good data set, which obviously you do with data sites, you're not going to have these orphan record situations. So for this first iteration, this first bit of understanding, you want to go with just inner join. This is super common and powerful, obviously, and this is filtering or clauses. So obviously, if you looked at the data, there's actually, when we get the data from Xero, there isn't a table for invoices and a different table for bills. They just lump that all in one structure and give it all to us. So we are only interested in the receivables here. We aren't interested in the bills being sent out. We are interested in sales, i.e. money coming in the door. So we want to say invoice type described equals accounts receivable, and the status is in those things. I've been a bit lazy here and used the integers, the numbers, instead of the name. We usually do that under the hood because it's a lot more performance and efficient. But again, the concept goes on and on here. You could say, and I only want invoices for a particular customer, and I.customer equals blah. Probably not a great example in this context, but you can go on and on and on and on in refining that. What that means is that you don't have to have one huge view trying to do too much. You can create smaller views for specific purposes, etc. And then finally, this group by statement here. Now, this is probably the sort of more complicated thing to get across, but essentially what it means is aggregating and summing. So I might actually do a separate video on that, etc. But from now on, essentially, I literally cannot think of one thing that is missing from this bit of SQL that is a core fundamental piece of what is going on. So if I was able to, even 50, 75% successfully explain that to you in the last 5 minutes or whatever it is, that just goes to show you that learning these core fundamentals is not difficult, and actually knowing them or being able to Google quickly or look at an example, that's what we usually do anyway, or even better, ask ChatGPT. But being able to read a few of these core fundamentals is extremely valuable and extremely powerful. Right, so all we need to do then is run this query. I hope that it doesn't throw an error. And as you can see here, it's done the customer rename, and we're getting some data back. This is just demo data, so there's not a huge amount, but whether you had these 8 records or if you had 15 million records, the view doesn't change. Nothing is going to change about this view. There is a little bit here around, which I will include now, and that is this union word. So union basically just means appending, and if I was to just copy in this little bit here, just bear with me, we won't run it in with this example. Union just basically means, union basically just means that we are adding, appending another query onto the end. And as you can see here, very similar to the invoices, we've got credit notes and the line items using an inner join, as well as we're saying, hey, we know this is a negative, let's make all the values negative, etc. But for this intents and purposes, let's get rid of that. And then the final little bit is we need to tell the database, hey mate, we're pretty happy with this view now. We would like to have this called something. So we say create view, Xero Sales View, as blah blah blah. Give it a run. It's now going to create that as a view. A view is not a copy of data. It's almost like a runtime report layout, essentially. And you can use that to, let's just refresh this, and we can use that to execute the data whenever we need it, essentially. And that's pretty much it as far as that goes. What I might do is just show you how this could be used. So you could pull this down into Excel and use it as you normally do. You could pull it into Power BI and go and visualize it as you want. You can push it to Google Sheets, you can pull it into Google Looker. The reporting tool doesn't matter. The point is you're not asking the reporting tool to do any data manipulation, because whilst they can sometimes do that, they're not very efficient at doing that, and also it requires a lot more maintenance ongoing for you to maintain that. It puts a lot more onus and key dependency on the report developer or the report author, whereas keeping it up with the database layer, perfect spot for it. What we can do is go and say to our good old trusty ChatGPT friend, I would like to query this data. So we just go in there and say, here is a Microsoft view we want to query. So we can say, show me the top customer in this data set. I'm using the word data set, but you could use whatever you want. And essentially what ChatGPT is going to do then is it's actually going to read from the views and create the query, and already, even in this example, there's the top one there for the customer. We're querying the sales view. We're grouping by these two things because we don't want to show the other columns. And now we can execute that. So even, I hope, with the little bit of sort of SQL conveying that we've done in this video, whilst there are tools available to create the SQL for you, just having a few fundamental sort of core principles and a bit of knowledge, you will be able to get on top of your data set, get it into the right format, and then just focus on what you need the data for, not actually working on the data. Hope that makes sense. Cheers. Any questions anytime, fire away.